Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of Found Friday, a weekly web series dedicated to all things findability related in content marketing, search, digital, and welcome back, Ray.
Hey,
Ray has been out of town at our Found conference in Tokyo. So, Ray, anything you want to share from that experience? I know we've been doing our Found conference in the US and Tokyo for a number of years. We've got one in Columbus, Ohio on September 26th, so we're excited about that. But yeah, tell me a little bit about how that went.
yeah, it was really good. I was in our Tokyo office for about 2 weeks this time, and we actually moved into a new office. So we've got a great new location right in the middle of Tokyo, about 5 minutes away from Tokyo Station. It's a beautiful location. Lots of other cool companies are in the same office building that we are. I think there's Slack is there and Skyscanner and a number of others. So great place to be. Great for networking and working with other startups in the area. And we did our event there for the first time too. We had previously done our event on another side of Tokyo. So it's cool to be able to have everything in one place and have all of our customers and attendees see the new space right at the same time. Overall, it was a really good event. We do two events typically in Japan every year. We do our larger one in January, might be February this coming year, and basically the winter one is kind of like a broader focus on SEO and content marketing, more marketing strategy focused. And then our summer conference is much more focused on the technical aspects of SEO. So this is where a lot of our customers who speak at those events are typically pretty hardcore technical teams, and they're focused on like the very latest trends, what they're seeing on the algorithms. When they use our product, they're typically there's typically some sort of like data science function to their usage of our platform and data. So we have a product called SERP Intelligence that's essentially a data product that people use. And that goes super deep into analyzing all the various aspects of the SERP, and we can provide that to customers like Redshift data warehouses or different data warehousing tools that they have, and they do some additional analysis on that. So there are some cool case studies that came out of that process, and it was great to see everyone there. So I think this time we had about 160 people altogether, which is a pretty good size for our summer event, and lots of excitement. Seemed like they had a pretty good time, had a great party afterwards as well. So always fun.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I love that we're in the same place as Slack, so when it goes down, we just ask the team to go over there and ask them what's going on.
I'm not sure they have their fingers on that particular button, but it doesn't hurt.
Well, kind of speaking a little bit about technical and non-technical aspects of SEO. Today's topic is programmatic SEO and content, and we're excited to tackle that because a lot of times what is discussed about SEO is from kind of this technical SEO or non-technical aspect, and I think people kind of get a little bit hung up on that. But there's a lot of other ways to look at, really good organic content workflows and search workflows and the strategies that we use for it. So let's kind of start out today by defining programmatic SEO.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny term actually. Programmatic, usually when you're talking about online marketing, and you hear people talking about programmatic, what they're typically referring to is programmatic advertising, programmatic ad buys, real-time bidding, that sort of thing. And you didn't really ever hear this word applied to SEO until really in the last few years. And there may be a better term that eventually comes out to replace it, but it's kind of an interesting term because SEO is obviously highly related to marketing through organic content, inbound marketing means. And so there's not always this idea, especially for people who are coming from more of a kind of a content focused marketing background. The idea of programmatic SEO sounds kind of like very technical and a little bit unusual, but it's actually one of the oldest ways that SEO has worked for a lot of businesses. Many businesses have been built on the back of what we would call programmatic SEO. So the simplest definition of this would be basically database-driven SEO or template-driven SEO. So If I give you some examples, it'll be very clear. Sites like everything from Expedia, Zillow, Yelp, Amazon, of course. You could actually even make arguments now that Google is getting into this with their different types of universal search, and it's basically anything that you've got database-driven content that can either be created through companies who have large catalogs or offerings or data that they're basically surfacing to various search terms. And also it would be things like user-generated content, any e-commerce catalogs, all of that's going to fall under what we would consider to be this overall category of programmatic SEO. And basically, the thing that is most important about programmatic SEO for people to understand is that the really good strategic view on this is going to take into account user demand by looking at search volume and a very strong kind of segmentation strategy to understand exactly how they should build out the architecture of their site. So we'll talk about some of that. We'll talk about some of the different technical aspects of this. And also, I think it's probably worth talking during our call today about what the customer journey looks like, where people land in the funnel, and what intent and so forth looks like as well.
Yeah, intent's a really big part of this. And I think that one of the things so you touch on a lot of important stuff there. And the first is programmatic is often a word that's applied to kind of more that advertising and media space, right? And so when you say programmatic SEO, I think people may get kind of a little bit confused about what that exactly means. So the definition really helps. And the examples of some companies that can do that are also really helpful. And a lot of our examples are really large enterprise site portfolios, and, like similar to folks we work with, right? And then, but I also want to say that this is something that we've seen smaller organizations put into practice as well. It's kind of this idea of this, you may not be a huge e-commerce site, but that doesn't mean that you can't take this templatized approach to a lot of pieces of content. So, one of the funny things is this show's actually a really good example. The templatized programmatic approach to the show itself, the content that goes into that, the blog posts that are then done, the follow-up pieces. There's so many things that can really be kind of looked at from what is the intent behind why somebody would come here, what funnel stage does that necessarily represent, how does that help out, so things that I think that I don't want people to get hung up on the idea that if they're not working at this really large organization, that they cannot take a more programmatic approach to some of their efforts. And we actually bucket that out when we talk about programmatic SEO. We talk about programmatic, so it's not technical and non-technical, because you can have programmatic on a lot of different aspects of your workflow, right? Whether it's technical or not. We are really breaking it out into kind of programmatic SEO versus what we would call a curated custom content SEO approach. We were talking a lot about, this scalability. So this does go back to some more stuff, but some more enterprise level things. But even companies who may not be huge enterprises may have an international presence. So there's often this need to help do some programmatic efforts on international content, areas kind of outside the US market, or whatever your native market is. Talk a little bit about why kind of a lot of this programmatic approach is so important when it comes to international.
Well, the thing that's interesting about search and Google in particular is that given the fact that English is such a dominant language internationally, there's multiple orders of magnitude more content available in English than there are in other languages. And so, especially those markets where Google has taken the #1 position almost by default in different countries that are not primarily English speaking, you still will see just a ton more available content if you're doing comparisons for different content categories, because people in the English speaking markets really early on just figured out that they figured out a lot of programmatic SEO. They figured out a lot of the scalable content creation techniques, and they were just very sophisticated at creating a lot of content that matched overall search demand. And also just, there's a lot of media creation, a lot of culture creation happens. You've got Hollywood, you've got the larger brands, you've got so many different reasons for why content a lot of times will come out first and in greater volumes in the English speaking markets than in other markets. And so that's creates a highly competitive market in, like the US or UK or Australia or what have you. But what's interesting is that there is, for people, I'm assuming most of our listeners have read the book, The Blue Ocean Strategy, and are familiar with this concept of blue oceans, which is basically there is very little competition naturally in markets. And so in many ways, even still today, the non-English speaking markets of the web, especially where Google is dominant, there is this huge blue ocean of opportunity in almost every market that we see. So Japan is an interesting case, but like all over Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, India, of course, the Middle East, Latin America, Europe kind of has its own, nuances, but there's so many different areas where there just isn't nearly as much content in those markets for all the different potential search queries as you would see an equivalent number in English speaking markets. And so this is something that for us, when we work with our customers, it's one of the things that we really emphasize to them, because for these companies that have maybe achieved some level of traction or even fantastic traction in the English speaking markets, as they're looking for that next phase of growth, we strongly promote international to those companies that we think it's going to be, a good channel for them. And Asia in particular, for this reason, well, for a couple of reasons, but this is one of the major reasons, is it's on fire. There's just so many companies investing heavily into it right now, but so few companies actually know what they're doing there. And so there's going to be, I think the next 5 to 10 years are going to be really interesting.
How do we feel about the impact of the differences in how Google rolls out algorithm changes here in the US versus the sometimes lag time that we see in Asian markets, and addressing things like that and the challenges that come with that in Asian markets, and then specifically in Asian markets like China and Korea, where there are different search engines that have an entirely different outlook. And I also know that one of the things that you and I were talking about when we had our team here a few weeks ago, that's maybe something a little bit different, that if you're not actively involved in the Asian market, is the high use of review sites, right? And a lot of that is right for programmatic SEO content, because it's a very different thing than what we have here.
Yeah. So on the first question, the differences between the kind of the rollout of the algorithms in these different markets, when you're talking about Google specifically, the lag time is a lot less than it used to be, especially for the larger markets. It used to be a pretty well-defined thing, and you could almost count on it in terms of measured in months by what the lag time would be. For the major markets such as Japan and other markets, that lag time is a lot less. It's almost, I wouldn't say quite simultaneous, but it's pretty close these days, depending on the type of algorithm change. There are other markets though where I don't know, I'm not, it could be a function of this blue ocean phenomenon that I was talking about. It could be a function of lag time in the algorithm. It's, it probably required a deeper technical analysis to reveal, but there are certain markets like Thailand or Vietnam or so forth where really old school SEO hacks still kind of work. And we generally don't recommend those to people just because we've already seen how that plays out. So we definitely recommend a stronger, more strategic focus on content there. But, we do see people being successful with, silly things like keyword stuffing and title tags and stuff like that. So that's not going to last. It's already being very quickly eradicated, but that's one area where we see some people trying to gain some short-term, arbitrage. The second question, though, which is also really interesting, was when you're talking about non-Google, where you're talking about like Korea, where Google is barely even a factor. China, obviously, you've got Baidu and other search engines. Russia, huge market. Yandex is the dominant player there. Those are each one of those are markets and search engines that basically require their own strategy and set of expertise around that. So when our team works with our customers on those, we try to help them understand what those key differences are. We've written about this in the past. I know we're planning to update some of our reports on, SEO in Japan and SEO in Russia and China and so forth. There's just a lot of big differences in the way they work, and you have to understand. You have to have if you think to the degree that good copywriting and good writing and good content creation matters in Google, well, equally matters. It's not like conversions suddenly go away. It's not like copywriting just goes away in those languages. The problem is it's just a lot harder to find. If you're an American company, for example, trying to find good talent there, you actually have to have strong bilingual people who can tell you what good is, even in the first place. So there's lots of, we could do probably multiple episodes just on that topic alone.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting too, so I just did a webinar for women in digital yesterday, and one of the things that I touched on that I think is important to think of when we're talking about programmatic search, because programmatic search is programmatic content as well, right? So, you can't really separate the idea of these things. Is that when I think a lot of times when people think about programmatic SEO, if they have ever thought about programmatic SEO or SEO workflows, they're thinking about Google, but there are now what we would call alternative search engines, right? That's Amazon, that's YouTube, that's Pinterest, that's all these other things that you can apply these same programmatic type concepts to, but you need to do it differently, right? You need to have a programmatic strategy that matches the search engine. So we've got international search engines and folks who care about those, and that requires a specific strategy. We've got these alternative search engines, because like Amazon's A9 algorithm operates differently, but there are still ways that you can programmatically tackle and deal with that stuff. The way that YouTube serves up content, and I know that that's tied into Google, but it's different than the way, obviously, because it's a video platform, would serve up, like normal search results. So I think that there's a lot to kind of really into. So in the interest of, we always try to keep the shows, to approximately 30 minutes ish, so people can watch them on lunch hours or whatever, is talking a little bit about what kind of core elements that performing well in programmatic would involve, so that we can give people an idea of, if you're thinking about diving into this, or you've already started, like what may be some areas that you haven't thought of or maybe missing.
So when we talk to people about programmatic, we like to help them understand what's involved. So we look at basically understanding where your customers, if you're talking about kind of like a customer journey or a funnel, if you don't have an idea of what your funnel looks like and all the different stages in which you can engage with your customers, that would be the first step that I would recommend getting involved in, is really doing an analysis of your business and understanding how you're going to attract those customers at various stages of the funnel, and understand what you're going to do there. So I'm assuming that some sort of programmatic interaction is relevant in this case. So if that's the case, then generally, if you look at all the different types of sites that are out there that are, I wouldn't say this is hard and fast, but it's very typical. The types of businesses that work really well as programmatic sites tend to be kind of middle of funnel, right? You're not going to be looking for very high level informational, tell me about this or tell me about that. It's more like, I want to book a flight, I want to book a hotel, I'm looking for a house, I'm looking for this specific address. So it's going to be middle of funnel and below, in terms of the type of content you're creating. That's nice in the sense that it's very well defined, but it's also challenging because those tend to be very competitive terms. So you have to have at the next stage, once you figured out where you are, then you have to think about, okay, how are you going to perform well for those types of searches? And that involves a couple of things. The first thing is you need to focus very heavily on having a very clean, a very scalable and high performing technical architecture to your website. It's even today, like it's amazing in this 2018, how many sites out there are just not optimized from a performance perspective, both on desktop and mobile is kind of a whole other story as well. So really nailing down the technical sides of your architecture, making sure your information architecture is solid and clean and navigable and everything is super important. But then assuming that, I mean, that's kind of table stakes. Once you have that, then you have to think about a couple of core things related to your strategy. Most importantly is, given that you are going to be playing in pretty competitive search landscapes, what is your differentiation strategy, both from a user engagement perspective, which is very important in SEO as well. How are you going to create better content at scale in a way that works in a programmatic business model? How are you going to do that? How are you going to ensure quality? How are you going to create enough content in the first place? All of that stuff is, and how are you going to be better than your competitors? So there's lots of different things that go into that. And then also, what is your promotion strategy for that content? Obviously, we're talking about SEO, but there's other ways to drive traffic and getting the word out there and getting people aware of things. All of these things they have a very strong snowball effect. So it's important to look at them holistically. And then, do you have a dedicated growth team to managing this? Do you have the right people in place to manage this? It's not something like you can just flip on your database and have things working. And yeah, it'll work once you get indexed, it'll work to a certain degree, but as you start to perform better and better, you're going to need to have a dedicated growth team working with you, whether that's in-house or working with a partner or some combination.
A couple of things that I think are really interesting in that is, I think that, one thing is when you talk about something being table stakes, right? Like a nice clean architecture, people are like, oh yeah, maybe not that big of a deal, table stakes, right? Like I want to get to the strategy.
Yep.
Table stakes means that is a must-have to buy in and be a part of the game. That is that's what that means. So I think that kind of like glossing over that concept or saying that's not my department and I don't even know if we have that would mean that if you spent a bunch of time working on something that without knowing whether or not you were already doing like the foundational layer, means you could just be wasting a bunch of time. So like don't waste a bunch of time if you don't know whether or not that's something that you've got and don't know what to look for. You can ask us, but also like check around your organization. Really important to kind of take a look at. Another thing that we've talked about as well is kind of this idea of building authority and kind of like these kind of repositories of authority from the ground up, right? And this comes to where, maybe a lot of what you're focusing on, because we want to be really good about our research and our keyword selection, is we want to make kind of some of these groups of content. And if we're looking at like a lower in the funnel intent situation, we have an opportunity with like a lot of what would be more specific searches and long tail searches, and you can create a lot of content that programmatically to start to address these things. And as you build these pieces of content, it's kind of this like rising tide idea of you actually will start to improve and rank for some other things. So I think that I think one of the strategies that, we saw, especially a long time ago, although it still happens a lot, is, somebody will call and be like, I want to rank for the word coffee. And I'm like, why?
Yeah.
Like it'll be a really generalized thing, but there's tons of individual pages of content that aren't optimized for anything really specific. They're optimized for like more generalized terms, or maybe not optimized at all. And so what we're missing is with this programmatic approach, especially when you're kind of cranking out all this content, is how can I actually really make sure that at a segment level, both based on intent, based on products or features or whatever it is that I'm creating this content around, I'm mirroring like the intent behind why somebody would be there and the specific questions and queries that would have gotten them to that page, and then making sure that all the elements of that page are optimized to answer that in a repeatable fashion.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Table stakes is it's another one that like we could talk a lot about. Another one that is, again, going back to kind of what we were talking about in the beginning, which is how well do you understand your core business model? What is the line of communication of that business model from you to your executive team, and also vice versa? How does your executive team communicate that vision for your core business model back down into the operational levels of what does that mean on a day-to-day basis of all of the different measurement. How are you measuring that? What are your KPIs? Have you set your traffic KPIs? What are your conversion KPIs? And when you're talking about programmatic in particular, given that it is so difficult to acquire new customers and new visitors in the first place because of how competitive these landscapes are, what is your retention strategy? You don't want to have to keep acquiring new traffic all the time. You want the same people coming back over and over again. That means creating a really high quality user experience. And if you're talking about programmatic, that means very fast database queries and everything else. So again, it's this technical side of things is super important. And we have a monitoring product that we're in the process of, not to pitch the product right now, but just to mention it because of why it matters. We have a new product called Demand Speed that we're beta testing with some customers right now. And one of the reasons we built this is because it's super important to help companies understand exactly where their site is not performing as well as they think it is. Most people think that once they've got a certain level of architecture in place and monitoring in place, things are good, but that's actually not really the case when it comes to user experience monitoring and overall performance monitoring, specifically from an SEO and UX perspective. So we built a really deep monitoring product to help people understand this. And I don't care if you use our product or something else, but the point is that you should be doing this and establishing really clear KPIs around that, because that's going to really help your team, especially if you're dealing with a very kind of strategic, creative, content-focused marketing team, helping them understand why those technical metrics really matter and how they have impacted the business is quite important.
Yeah, I want to, when we talk about understanding your business model, I think this is a good time for kind of a fun story, which is, do you understand the entire end-to-end situation of like what's actually happening, right? It doesn't just stop at the content. So obviously we can't get into everything about your business model today, but because we do want to go over a couple of like quick problems and stuff before we wrap up for the day. But here's a fun story is there's a product company, and it will go unnamed, and they were spending a ton of time and money working on kind of these like somewhat programmatic aspects of driving traffic, and they were getting a lot of traffic but no real conversions, and they spent a bunch of time trying to research why it was that if they'd created all this content to drive traffic to products on their site, and then they weren't getting these conversions, but they were seeing the product sell on other places. And so they were like, what is happening here? A really quick examination of their site led to the fact that they were sold out of the products on their site. So they've been spending all this time and effort driving traffic to a place where a conversion was never going to happen, at least not on their site, and they hadn't thought about the fulfillment aspect of that issue, right? So, I mean, when you think about like what it is you're actually doing, you have to make sure that everybody's in alignment all the way through the entire process of, if we do drive this traffic, if this somebody does get to this content and like something doesn't work, or they want to purchase or they have a question, what does that mean next? Like, do we have the infrastructure in place to handle the growth? Do we have the infrastructure in place to handle the questions? And like, can we actually fulfill on our promises? Because one thing I do know, especially if we're talking about Amazon, is not fulfilling on your promises will drop you off of rank so fast. Returns, bad ratings, bad user reviews, all things like that are really detrimental. And being sold out of stuff all the time or out of stock constantly like starts to mess with you. So, again, just something to think about. And I think that actually leads us into, when we're talking about programmatic search, a couple of common problems, because we talk a lot about like how it is that you can get set up, but we want to make sure that you start to recognize pitfalls faster.
Yep, absolutely. This iterative approach, most people who have kind of spend any time in the startup world are pretty familiar with the concepts around, the agile startup or the lean startup. And it's a business concept that is misunderstood in a lot of ways. And that would be an interesting topic at some point too. But the main core insight out of that actually came from the military. And it was basically the idea that the faster you can go through an iteration of whatever your entire business cycle iteration looks like, the faster you can do that, that means you can have more. And if you can have more iterations than your competitors, then you're going to win the battle. You're going to win that competition. So this is why it's very important to, if you don't even know what's going wrong and where the different areas in which your site may not be performing well, you may think you're iterating fastly, but you're probably getting killed and you don't even realize it. And the companies who are really dialed in have all their different technical pieces in place. They have their strategy in place. They've got their measurement in place, and they're iterating very quickly on it. And I guarantee you that's how they're going to win over time.
I think that one of the funny things about your analogy with the military is another thing that I like from the military is fast is smooth and smooth is fast.
Yep.
Which that is the other part of iterating quickly, is iterating smoothly. That doesn't mean that things go perfectly all the time. It goes back to that seamless situation we were talking about, which is, it's really hard to iterate quickly if you just constantly fall off a cliff or hit like life-altering roadblocks. Like you really have to make sure that when you're starting this process, as you iterate, you are smoothing out the situation so that eventually that is what makes it iteration quick, is that it is a fluid, fast process. And so I think that,
That's why.
Go ahead.
So good. I mean, it's a great analogy though, because when you're talking about, this is why a lot of times when we see companies trying to do this stuff, we recommend that small start, building that small case study internally of doing it once, see what the entire flow looks like, build your model around that. And that goes into that exact, slow is smooth and smooth is fast metaphor, because if you're in martial arts or shooting or military or whatever, doing it right the first time, even if it takes a little bit longer, helps you understand exactly what needs to be filled in. And then as you do that, then you can get better at it, and you have people internally who can practice, you be practitioners of that process throughout the company.
Yep. And I think that, hopefully what people take away from today's episode, which we do have to wrap up, is, this can actually be a huge benefit to organizations of a lot of different types. And to think that it's only for really big e-commerce things is a mistake. It's really for like lots of repetitive content. Of course, the most natural and obvious fit is e-commerce, but there are so many other places where things like this can be really beneficial, and that implementation doesn't have to be this incredibly difficult or kludgy thing. It's really about going and making sure that what needs to be taken care of is taken care of, because a little bit of work on the back end of this will speed things up and increase the overall performance of your organization, a lot, by simply taking a little bit of extra time to make sure, like we said, table stakes, architecture set up, team is in place. You kind of know what you're doing. You've got kind of these baseline things, setting KPIs, like what you mentioned, right? Like, do you know what good even is, and when you've actually fallen below it, right? So something like our demand speed product or something else to kind of keep an eye on that. Are you monitoring it? And before you even do any of that, and we didn't even mention it, which is a story for another time, is how are you even measuring your organic performance, and what does that look like? Are you doing it daily? Because like a lot of times when you're looking at programmatic, if you're only looking at weekly or monthly tracking, you're missing a lot of kind of like how this works out, especially over different search engines in different countries or across alternative search engines like, Amazon and different stuff. So lots of options there. Ray, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say the kind of biggest takeaways that I would encourage people to look into would be, one is when you're talking about programmatic, understand that where it's relevant to different types of businesses, where it's not going to be relevant to every type of business, of course, but one of the things for companies who are a programmatic site or business model, a lot of times they can actually benefit from non-programmatic, more organic content. And then we're starting to see this as a bigger trend, the traditionally non-programmatic sites, kind of brand sites. We see this a lot right now happening in apparel, fashion, as they're trying to expand internationally. They're all looking at various ways of getting into e-commerce, whether it's through Amazon or their own properties. And they they kind of missed the boat for the last 20 years on programmatic, and they let a lot of other companies take that channel from them. Some companies are trying to change that now, and there is a lot of lessons for them to learn. So I think you're going to see a lot more of this interchange between programmatic and kind of traditional content sites, and more companies doing both going forward. When you are involved in this programmatic strategy, it's critical, as you just said, to be capturing data on a daily level. Whether or not you're looking at it daily doesn't really matter, because what you want to be doing is be creating, conducting at a minimum monthly. Some companies are okay with quarterly, but really monthly, ideally even weekly, if you can get it, reviews of your strategy and your measurement and your performance. If, for those companies that are kind of planning a new e-commerce expansion or like an upgrade out of a traditional organic content site, then there's a lot of different things to look into. So we should probably do a show on that at some point. And we're always happy to just chat with people to see, if there's things they could be paying attention to.
Yeah, and I think that another really good place to get information on this that we're excited to be sharing is, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're doing Found Conference in Columbus, Ohio, September 26th. And if you're interested in joining, it's foundconf.com. You can find out more about that by messaging us. But a lot of times we share a lot of that content, kind of following up from that. And one of the things that we're doing is we're actually having some of our Found Conference guests as speakers on Found Friday. So they'll be joining us to tackle some of these topics, to be able to, chat a little bit deeper about what's going on in the industry as well. So we really look forward to that. With that, I will go ahead and close off today's show and say that it was nice to have you back, Ray. Doing this by myself for 30 minutes every week is always a challenge. But we look forward to chatting with you again next week, and we will see you then.
All right, sounds good.
Bye.
Thank you.